"I wish you were never born," my son said, raising his glass at my 67th birthday dinner, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I simply smiled, the kind of quiet, practiced smile that comes from a lifetime of learning when silence speaks louder than words. Because the truth is, by the time Daniel said those words, I already knew something was terribly wrong. The dining room looked beautiful that night, soft golden lights hanging above the long oak table, the same table where I had hosted every holiday for over 30 years. There were 12 place settings, polished silverware, linen napkins folded just the way my late husband used to like. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. Olivia had insisted on organizing the entire evening. She picked the guest list, chose the menu, even decided where everyone would sit. I was the guest of honor. Yet somehow I felt like a stranger in my own home. I noticed it in small ways at first. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room. The way Olivia would gently redirect Daniel whenever he tried to ask me something directly. The way I was no longer included in decisions about the house, the finances, even family plans. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. That maybe this was just what growing older felt like. But earlier that afternoon, everything changed. I had gone upstairs to look for an old photo album, something I thought might be nice to share after dinner. That's when I saw it. An envelope, carelessly left on the desk in Daniel's study. My name was on it, but it wasn't my handwriting. Inside were documents, official ones, property listings, legal forms, and right there, in clean black print, was the address of my home, marked as pending sale. My fingers went cold as I scanned the page again and again, searching for a mistake. My name wasn't there. Not as the owner. Not anywhere. It was as if I had already disappeared. I stood there for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in my hands, listening to the faint sound of laughter drifting up from downstairs as guests began to arrive. That was the moment I understood. This dinner wasn't just a celebration. It was a performance. And I was the only one who didn't know the script until now. So I placed the documents back exactly where I found them. I smoothed out the envelope. I adjusted my reflection in the mirror. And then I walked downstairs, ready to play my part. When Daniel made his toast and those words left his mouth, I simply held my smile, because what he didn't know was that I had already seen everything. No one spoke after his words settled into the room. Not really. Not in any meaningful way. Just the soft clink of silverware and the low hum of someone forcing a laugh that did not belong there, and I could feel every pair of eyes flickering toward me, then away, as if they were all waiting to see whether I would break, whether I would cry, whether I would prove them right about what they must have been saying behind my back for months. But I did not give them that. I reached for the knife. Beside the cake, steady, precise, and I began to cut the first slice as if nothing had happened, as if my son had just wished me a happy birthday instead of erasing me with a single sentence, and I could feel Olivia watching me, not with concern, not even with discomfort, but with something colder, something measured, like she was evaluating whether the plan was still on track, whether I was reacting the way she expected, and that was when I knew for certain that this had not been a moment of anger or a careless mistake. This had been intentional, rehearsed even, because Daniel had never spoken to me like that before, not once in his 40 years, not even as a teenager when he slammed doors and told me he hated me over curfews and rules. This was different. This was something planted, something fed to him slowly over time until it sounded like his own voice. And as I placed the first slice of cake onto a plate, I noticed something else, something small but impossible to ignore. The guest list. It was not mine. These were not the people I would have invited. Neighbors I barely recognized, acquaintances of Olivia's, people who looked at me politely but without warmth, as if I were a story they had already heard about but never questioned. And I realized then that this entire evening had been carefully arranged to isolate me in plain sight, to make me feel out of place in my own home, and yet they had overlooked one thing. They had assumed I would remain unaware, that I would continue moving through the night as the quiet, grateful mother who did not ask questions, who did not challenge anything, and for a moment I almost did, because that had been my role for so many years, to keep the peace, to smooth over tension, to protect the image of family even when it came at my own expense, but the image of That document upstairs would not leave my mind. The clean, official language that had quietly removed me from the life I had built. And as I handed out slices of cake, smiling at each guest, thanking them for coming, I felt something shift inside me. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, steady clarity, the kind that does not ask for permission, the kind that does not need validation. And when Daniel finally looked at me again, perhaps expecting a reaction, an argument, something he could dismiss or justify, I simply met his eyes and gave him the same calm smile, because what he did not understand yet was that the moment he spoke those words, he had already lost something he could never take back, and I had already decided that I would not confront them tonight. Not here. Not in front of their carefully chosen audience, because some truths are not meant to be argued. They are meant to be revealed at the right time, in the right way, and as I set the knife down and wiped my hands gently with a napkin, I realized that this dinner was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something they would never see coming. The rest of the evening unfolded exactly the way Olivia must have planned, controlled down to the smallest detail, from the soft music playing in the background to the way guests rotated around the table. Each conversation carefully steered away from anything too personal, too real, and I watched it all with a new clarity that made everything feel sharper, almost distant, as if I were no longer inside the moment, but observing it from somewhere just outside myself. And that was when the patterns began to reveal themselves, the small things I had ignored. 4 months now lining up into something impossible to dismiss, like the time Daniel changed the locks on the back door and told me it was for security, yet somehow I was the last to receive a key, or the way Olivia had slowly taken over the household accounts, insisting it would be easier if she handled the bills, the taxes, the maintenance, and I had agreed because I trusted them, because that is what mothers do, they trust, even when something feels slightly off, even when the silence grows heavier each day. And now, standing in my own dining room, surrounded by people who felt like strangers, I realized that trust had been the very thing they relied on, the one weakness they never expected me to question. And as the night continued, I noticed how Daniel avoided looking at me directly, how his laughter sounded just a little too forced, as if he was trying to convince himself that everything was normal, that what he said earlier did not matter, or perhaps that it was justified. And Olivia, she moved through the room with effortless confidence, checking on guests, adjusting details, making sure everything appeared seamless. But every now and then, her eyes would flick toward me, quick and calculating, measuring my reaction, waiting for a crack that never came, and I could almost hear her thoughts, wondering if I had noticed, if I had figured it out, if I would say something. And that was when I understood something even more important than the documents upstairs. This was not just about the house, it was about control, about rewriting the narrative of who I was in this family, reducing me to something small, something temporary, something that could be quietly removed without consequence. And yet they had underestimated one thing. They had underestimated how much I had been paying attention, not just today, but for a long time, because the truth is, this was not the first moment that felt wrong. It was just the first time I allowed myself to see it clearly, like last Christmas when Olivia insisted on hosting and I arrived to find my usual seat at the head of the table replaced with a smaller chair at the side, or the summer before when Daniel casually mentioned that it might be easier if I moved into a smaller place, something more manageable, something that did not require so much upkeep. And at the time, I had smiled and nodded, telling myself they were just being practical, just looking out for me. But now those moments felt different, not like concern, but like preparation, like steps in a plan that had been unfolding quietly, patiently, while I continued believing I was still part of the life I had built. And as the last of the guests began to leave, offering polite goodbyes and compliments about the evening, I stood by the doorway, thanking each one, my voice calm, my expression steady. And when the door finally closed and the house fell into a quiet that felt heavier than before, I turned back toward the dining room where Daniel and Olivia remained, and for a brief moment, none of us spoke, the air between us filled with everything that had not been said, and in that silence, I realized something with absolute certainty. They thought tonight had been their turning point, the moment they established control. But in reality, it had been mine. Daniel was the first to move, clearing his throat as if he could reset the entire evening with a single breath, his voice softer now, almost careful, asking if I needed help cleaning up, and I nodded politely, the same way I had nodded for years whenever he offered something that sounded kind but felt distant. And together we began gathering plates from the table, the same table where I had once taught him how to hold a fork properly, where he used to spill juice and laugh without apology, where he would lean against my shoulder after dinner and tell me about his day, and the contrast between those memories and the man standing beside me now was so sharp that it almost felt unreal, like I was watching two different lives overlapping in the same space. And as I carried a stack of dishes into the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of Olivia through the reflection in the window, standing still, arms crossed lightly, observing us with that same quiet calculation, not saying a word, not offering to help, just watching, and it reminded me of something I had ignored for far too long, the way she always positioned herself slightly outside of situations, never fully involved, always assessing, always adjusting, like she was guiding everything from just beyond reach, and I realized then that Daniel had not changed overnight. He had been shifting slowly, piece by piece, under her influence, shaped by subtle suggestions, small corrections, quiet redirections that never sounded harsh, but always led him further away from me, and I could trace it back now, to the early days when she first joined our family, when she would gently laugh at my traditions, calling them old-fashioned, when she would suggest new ways of doing things that seemed harmless at first, more modern, more efficient. And I had welcomed it because I wanted her to feel comfortable, because I believed that making space for her would strengthen our family, not divide it, and for a while, everything appeared to work, until it did not. Until my voice became less necessary, my opinions less requested, my presence less central, and standing there in the kitchen, rinsing dishes under warm water, I understood something that felt both painful and strangely clarifying. I had not been pushed out all at once. I had been replaced gradually, so carefully that I almost thanked them for it. And when Daniel set down the last plate beside me, he hesitated, as if searching for something to say that could undo what had already been done. But there are moments that do not allow for easy repair, moments that expose too much to be covered with simple words. And instead of waiting for him to speak, I turned off the faucet, dried my hands slowly, and looked at him with the same calm expression I had held all evening, not angry, not hurt in any way he could easily recognize, just steady, just clear, and for the first time, he seemed uncertain, like he could not quite understand what he was seeing in me, and that uncertainty lingered as I walked past him and into the hallway, leaving him standing there with questions he did not yet know how to ask, because what he did not realize was that I was no longer trying to understand what they had done. I already knew, and now I was beginning to decide what I would do next. The house grew quiet after that, the kind of quiet that settles into the walls and makes every sound feel louder than it should, and I moved through the room slowly, turning off lights, straightening chairs, restoring everything to the way it had always been, not because it needed to be done, but because it gave me time to think, to let the pieces fall into place without interruption. And when I finally reached the staircase, I paused for just a moment, listening, hearing the faint murmur of Daniel and Olivia's voices in the living room, low and controlled, as if they believed I was already asleep, as if I had already been removed from the equation. And I did not need to hear the words to understand the tone. I had heard it before, in smaller moments, in half-finished sentences and quiet exchanges that stopped when I entered a room, and I continued upstairs without making a sound, each step steady, deliberate, until I reached my bedroom, the same room I had shared with my husband for decades, the same room that had once felt like the center of everything, and now felt like the last place that still belonged to me. And I closed the door gently behind me, not out of fear, but out of intention, because what I was about to do required calm, required focus, required a version of myself I had not needed in a very long time. And I walked over to the dresser and opened the bottom drawer, reaching past old photographs and neatly folded scarves until my hand found the small wooden box I had not touched in years, and inside were documents, original ones, signed and sealed long before Olivia had ever entered our lives, long before anyone thought to question where control truly rested. And I sat on the edge of the bed, placing the box beside me, opening it slowly, not with urgency, but with certainty, and as I reviewed each paper, each signature, each carefully written clause, I felt that same quiet clarity return, stronger now, sharper, because the truth was simple. No matter what they had planned, no matter what they believed they had already taken from me, they did not have what they thought they had, and they had made one critical mistake. They had acted too soon, revealing their intentions before securing their outcome, and that was something I could work with, something I could use, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to sit back slightly, not in relief but in understanding, because this was no longer about reacting to what they had done. It was about deciding how this would end, and I glanced toward the door, imagining them downstairs, confident, certain that everything was moving in their favor, unaware that the foundation beneath them was not as solid as they believed, and I closed the box carefully, resting my hand on top of it for a moment, grounding myself in the weight of it, in the history it represented, in the life I had built long before anyone tried to rewrite it. And then I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out into the quiet street beyond, the same street where I had raised my son, where I had watched him take his first steps, where I had believed, without question, that family meant permanence. And as I stood there, I realized that permanence is not something given, it is something protected. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, I was ready to protect it. Morning came quietly, the kind of soft gray light that slips through the curtains before the world fully wakes, and I was already dressed by the time the first sound of movement echoed from downstairs, not because I had not slept, but because sleep no longer felt necessary. Clarity had taken its place, and I carried the wooden box with me as I walked out of my bedroom, each step measured, each breath steady. And when I reached the kitchen, I found Olivia already there, standing by the counter. With a cup of coffee, her posture relaxed, but her eyes alert the moment she saw me, as if she had been expecting something, not this, but something, and she smiled, polite, controlled, asking if I had slept well, and I returned the same kind of smile, answering just enough to keep the surface intact, because there was no need to rush, no need to reveal anything before the right moment. And Daniel joined us shortly after, his expression careful, almost rehearsed, as if he had spent the night deciding how to behave, how to speak, how to pretend that nothing irreversible had been said, and he asked if I wanted breakfast, simple, ordinary, the kind of question that might have meant something different just days ago, but now felt like part of a script neither of us believed in anymore, and I declined gently, setting the wooden box on the table between us, not opening it, just letting it sit there, visible, present, and I noticed the way Olivia's eyes flickered toward it for a fraction of a second before returning to me, and that was enough. Enough to confirm what I already knew, that she understood more than she wanted to admit, that she recognized something in that small, unassuming box, and Daniel followed her gaze, slower, less certain, his confusion evident in the way his brow tightened slightly, and I let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable, not tense, just undeniable. And then I spoke, not accusing, not emotional, just clear, asking a simple question about the house, about the listing, about the documents I had found the day before, and the shift was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. Daniel's posture stiffened. Olivia's hand paused mid-motion around her coffee cup, and for a brief moment, neither of them answered, as if they were both calculating how much I knew, how much I had seen, how much they could still control, and I watched them carefully, not with anger, but with attention, because this was the moment that mattered. Not what they had done, but how they would respond when confronted with the truth. And Daniel finally spoke, his voice uncertain, offering explanations that sounded incomplete even as he said them, something about paperwork, about plans for the future, about making things easier for everyone, and Olivia stepped in smoothly, her tone calm, her words precise, framing everything as a misunderstanding, as a process that had not yet been finalized, as something that would have been discussed with me eventually, and I listened, nodding slightly, letting them speak, letting them build their version of reality piece by piece, because the more they said, the clearer everything became, and when they finished, when the room settled back into that quiet again, I reached forward and placed my hand on the wooden box, not opening it yet, just resting it there, and I looked at them both with the same steady calm I had carried since the night before, because what they did not realize was that this conversation was no longer about what they thought they could take. It was about what I had already decided they would never have. They waited for me to open the box, I could see it in the way their eyes kept drifting toward it, in the way the silence stretched just a little too long, but I did not give them that, not yet. Instead, I pulled my hand back slowly and stood up, smoothing the front of my blouse as if this were just another ordinary morning, as if nothing had shifted beneath the surface, and I told them I had a few errands to run, my voice calm, almost gentle, and Daniel blinked, clearly not expecting that response, not expecting me to step away from the conversation so easily, while Olivia's expression remained composed but tighter now, her control slipping just enough to reveal uncertainty, and I could almost feel the questions forming in their minds, wondering where I was going, what I was planning, how much I actually knew, and I let those questions sit with them as I picked up my purse and walked toward the front door, each step steady, unhurried, because this was no longer about reacting, this was about timing, and timing, I had learned, was everything. And as I stepped outside, the morning air felt different, clearer, as if the weight that had settled over the house the night before could not follow me here, and I drove across town to a place I had not visited in years, a quiet office building with familiar glass doors and a name I still trusted, and when I walked inside, the receptionist looked up with polite surprise, greeting me by name after a brief pause of recognition. And that alone told me something important, that there were still parts of my life untouched by the version of me they had tried to shrink, and a few minutes later, I was sitting across from a man who had known me long before Daniel ever thought to question my place, long before Olivia ever stepped into this family, and I placed the wooden box on his desk, opening it this time, revealing the documents inside, not dramatically, not with force, just with quiet certainty. And I asked him to review everything, to confirm what I already believed to be true, that the ownership, the authority, the decisions they thought they had already made were not theirs to make, and as he read through each page, his expression shifted from neutral to focused, then to something firmer, something that felt like validation without needing to be spoken, and he explained it clearly, carefully, outlining the protections that had been in place all along, the signatures that mattered, the clauses that could not be bypassed without my consent, and I listened without interrupting because this was not new information to me, not entirely, but hearing it out loud solidified something inside me, something that had been forming since the moment I saw that listing, and when he finished, I simply nodded, closing the box again with steady hands, because now I knew exactly where I stood, not where they thought I stood, not where they wanted me to stand, but where I had always been, and as I left the office and stepped back into the sunlight, I realized that whatever came next would not be decided by them, not anymore, because for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer reacting to the story they had written for me. I was about to rewrite it entirely. When I returned home that afternoon, the house was exactly as I had left it, but the atmosphere had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but in the quiet details, the way Daniel stood up a little too quickly when I walked in, the way Olivia closed her laptop just a second too late, as if she had been watching the front door more closely than she wanted to admit. And I greeted them both with the same calm tone, the same measured smile, because there was no reason to change anything yet, not until everything was in place, and I set my purse down, placing the wooden box gently on the table again, letting it become a presence in the room, something neither of them could ignore, and I told them I had been thinking about what they said that morning, about the house, about the future, choosing my words carefully, giving them just enough to believe they still had control of the narrative. And Daniel seemed to relax slightly, stepping closer, his voice softer now, explaining again how they were only trying to help, how the house was too much for me, how downsizing would be easier, more practical, and Olivia nodded beside him, reinforcing every point with that same composed confidence, and I listened, really listened this time, not to what they were saying but to how they were saying it, the certainty, the assumption, the quiet expectation that I would agree, that I would step aside willingly, and when they finished, I nodded slowly, letting a small pause settle between us before I spoke again, telling them that if we were going to make decisions about the house, then we should do it properly, together, with everything laid out clearly, and I suggested we invite a few people over the next evening. Close friends, a small gathering, nothing formal, just a chance to discuss things openly, and I saw the hesitation flicker across Daniel's face, the uncertainty in Olivia's eyes, but they did not refuse, because from their perspective, This sounded like progress, like cooperation, like the outcome they had been guiding me toward all along, and that was exactly what I needed them to believe. And the rest of the day passed quietly, almost peacefully, with small conversations and careful movements, each of us playing our roles with precision, until evening settled in and the house grew still again. And later, when I was alone in my room, I opened the wooden box once more, reviewing everything one last time, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to feel it fully, the certainty, the control, the truth that had been mine all along. And as I closed the lid, I allowed myself a single, steady breath, not of relief, but of readiness, because tomorrow, everything would be placed on the table, not just their plans, but mine, and for the first time since this began, I knew exactly how it would unfold. The next evening arrived with a quiet certainty that settled into every corner of the house, and I prepared everything with the same care I had always given to family gatherings, setting the table, arranging chairs, placing glasses in perfect alignment, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I understood that details matter, especially when truth is about to be revealed. And one by one, the guests arrived. A small group, just as I had suggested, familiar faces who had known me for years, people who remembered this home long before any changes had begun, and I greeted them warmly, guiding them into the dining room where Daniel and Olivia stood waiting, their confidence still intact, though I could see the faint tension in the way Olivia held her posture a little too straight, the way Daniel kept glancing toward me as if trying to read something he could not quite understand. And once everyone was seated, I remained standing for a moment, allowing the room to settle, allowing the quiet to take shape, and then I began to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, explaining that there had been discussions about the future of the house, about changes that were being considered, and I saw Daniel nod slightly, as if this was unfolding exactly as he expected, as if this was the moment where I would confirm his version of events, and I let that assumption linger for just a second longer before I reached for the wooden box and placed it at the center of the table, opening it slowly, revealing the documents inside, and I began to explain what they actually meant, the ownership that had never changed, the legal protections that had always been in place, the signatures that could not be replaced without my consent, and as I spoke, the room shifted, not with noise, but with understanding, the kind that does not need to be announced, and Daniel's expression changed first, confusion giving way to realization, while Olivia remained still, her composure holding for a moment longer before the edges began to tighten, and I continued, not accusing, not raising my voice, simply stating the facts, that any attempt to sell this house without my approval was invalid, that any documents suggesting otherwise were incomplete at best and misleading at worst, and that decisions about this home would not be made without me, not now, not ever. And when I finished, I closed the box gently, resting my hands on the table as I looked at them both, not with anger, but with a calm that left no room for argument, and no one spoke immediately, because there was nothing left to say, not in the way they had planned, not in the way they had expected, and after a moment, I stepped back slightly, giving them space, not out of kindness, but because the truth had already done what it needed to do, and as the evening slowly began to dissolve into quiet conversations and careful glances, I realized that nothing in this house had actually been taken from me, not my place, not my voice, not my life. It had only been tested, and now it had been firmly reclaimed.